You see her pouring bad decaf on a Tuesday flight to Denver. Shoulders stooped, polite, empty smile. You'd never guess those hands used to wrestle a twin-engine Hornet through contested airspace. Not until the sky broke, the cockpit went dark, and the intercept jets showed up on our wing. The ice scoop felt sticky. It always felt sticky by the third hour of the flight, coated in a micro-layer of spilled ginger ale and cabin dust. Audrey scraped the bottom of the aluminum bin, the dull shk-shk sound burying itself under the relentless, droning hum of the Boeing 767's twin turbofans. She dumped the ice into a plastic cup, handed it to a man in 14B. He didn't look up from his glowing tablet, didn't say thank you. Audrey preferred it that way. She pushed the beverage cart forward. It weighed nearly 200 pounds fully loaded, and its front right wheel had a stutter that pulled hard into the aisle carpet. Her lower back ached, a dull, familiar throbbing right at the base of her spine. It wasn't an injury from lifting luggage or wrestling carts, though that's what she told the company doctor. It was compression. Years of pulling 8 Gs in a titanium tub, the brutal physics of dogfighting crushing her vertebrae together like an accordion. Now she served pretzels. It was safe. It was anonymous. Trash. Hand me your trash, please. Her voice was an automated hum, a soft, deferential purr designed to blend into the upholstery. The passengers saw a 30-something woman with her hair pulled into a tight, shellacked twist, wearing a polyester navy blue scarf that choked her neck. They saw a quiet, tired flight attendant. Nobody looked closely enough to notice the tiny white scar slicing through her left eyebrow, or the way her eyes constantly scanned the cabin, cataloguing exits, calculating weights, assessing threats out of sheer, unbreakable habit. Up front, Captain David Adler was flying. Adler was a 20-year commercial veteran, impeccably pressed uniform, smelled like dry cleaning chemicals and expensive peppermint mouthwash. He was a systems manager, really. He typed coordinates into an autopilot and let the computers do the flying. Audrey had spoken to him exactly twice since they boarded in Newark. Once to confirm the cabin was secure, once to bring him a black coffee. He had called her sweetheart. She hadn't corrected him. She wanted the invisibility. After her third deployment to a sandbox that smelled permanently of burning trash and oxidized blood, after the court-martial of her wingman, after the endless, deafening roar of the catapult launches that rattled her teeth loose. She just wanted the quiet. She wanted a job where the biggest crisis was running out of Bloody Mary mix. She pushed the cart to row 22. Then the floor dropped. It wasn't turbulence. Turbulence is jagged. Turbulence shakes the airframe, rattling the overhead bins like loose teeth. This was a smooth, terrifying absence of lift, a heavy, sickening plunge. Audrey's stomach slammed into her throat. The coffee in the pot she was holding launched straight upward, a brown, scalding geyser that splashed across the ceiling panels. Screams erupted, thin, reedy sounds over the roar of the engines. The cart tried to lift off the floor. Audrey slammed her foot down on the brake pedal, her left hand instinctively grabbing the recessed handle of an overhead bin. She didn't scream. Her breathing didn't even accelerate. The cold, ugly spike of adrenaline hit her bloodstream, tasting like old pennies on the back of her tongue. The aircraft slammed back into level flight just as violently. The coffee rained back down, splattering across the carpet, smelling fiercely of burnt beans and melting plastic. Melting plastic. Audrey froze. She inhaled sharply through her nose. Beneath the smell of the spilled coffee and the sudden, sharp stench of passenger sweat, there was something else. Acrid. Chemical. It smelled like roasting copper wiring. The cabin lights flickered. Once, twice, then they died completely. The low, comforting hum of the ventilation system choked out. The ambient noise of the cabin shifted. Without the electronic hum of the avionics bay beneath the floorboards, the wind tearing past the fuselage sounded harsh, raw, like a beast scratching at the aluminum. The emergency floor path strips illuminated, casting an eerie, pale green glow against the passengers' pale legs. "Please remain seated," Audrey yelled. She didn't use the soft, deferential purr anymore. The voice that cut through the darkened cabin was hard. A drill instructor's bark, a flight lead calling out a bandit. She shoved the cart backward, locking it into the galley bulkhead. She needed the intercom. She ripped the handset off the cradle near the jump seat and punched the 2-digit code for the cockpit. Static. Thick, fuzzy, analog snow. She hit it again. Nothing. The plane banked. Hard left. A steep, uncoordinated turn that pressed Audrey's ribs into the bulkhead. Adler was flying manually, and he was overcorrecting. The nose pitched up, the engines whining as they strained against the sudden drag. They were heavy. Over the Rockies, navigating a dense soup of grey cumulonimbus clouds. They had no cabin power, and if the intercom was dead, what else had the electrical surge taken out? Audrey felt the familiar, toxic comfort of crisis wrapping around her shoulders. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. "God damn it," she thought. "I just wanted to hand out pretzels. Panic is a physical thing. It has a texture. It's thick, making the air in the cabin feel humid and heavy." A woman in row 12 was hyperventilating, her chest heaving in rapid, shallow spasms. A man in an expensive suit was unbuckling his belt, standing up in the darkened aisle despite the sharp, 30-degree bank of the aircraft. "Sit down," Audrey barked, pointing a rigid finger at his chest. "I need to see what's happening. The oxygen masks didn't—" "I said sit the fuck down," Audrey snapped. The profanity hung in the air, shocking the man into submission. He dropped back into his seat, his eyes wide, staring at the quiet flight attendant who suddenly looked a foot taller. Audrey moved up the aisle, bracing her hands on the seatbacks to balance against the erratic pitching of the plane. Adler was struggling. The flight controls in a 767 were hydraulically actuated, but electrically commanded in many aspects. If they had suffered a total bus failure, he was wrestling a massive, dead-weight machine with manual reversion. But why the steep descent? She reached the forward galley. The smell of electrical fire was stronger here. The thick, noxious scent of ozone and charred insulation. The cockpit door was sealed, locked, impervious to anything short of a sledgehammer. She looked out the small porthole window in the galley door. The clouds were dense, a milky grey void swallowing the wingtips. They were descending rapidly into the weather, violating their assigned altitude. Suddenly, the grey void tore open. Audrey stopped breathing. Less than 50 feet off the right wing, a shadow materialized out of the mist. It was a spearhead of dark, matte grey metal, moving with lethal, predatory grace. Twin vertical stabilizers, a sharply angled canopy, the massive dark intakes of two General Electric F-404 engines, an F/A-18 Hornet. The fighter jet hung there, perfectly suspended relative to the lumbering 767, slicing through the turbulence that was throwing the airliner around. Audrey felt a ghost pain in her hands, the phantom sensation of a flight stick. She stared at the fighter. Under its wings, she saw the sleek, deadly shapes of AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles. This wasn't a weather escort. This was an intercept. Why are they here? She thought, her mind racing through emergency protocols faster than the panicked passengers could blink. Total comms failure. We dropped off ATC radar. We're a rogue aircraft over restricted airspace. Adler has lost his transponder. The Hornet banked slightly, displaying its underside. A classic headbutt maneuver. It was a visual signal. You have been intercepted. Follow me. The 767 didn't respond. Instead, the nose pitched down again. Adler didn't see him. Or if he did, he didn't understand the military signals. Audrey saw the Hornet's pilot look over, a helmeted head turning toward the passenger jet. She knew what that pilot was thinking. They aren't complying. Are they hijacked? Are they a kinetic threat to a population center? Another Hornet broke through the clouds on the left wing. Two of them. A flight. They had the airliner boxed in. Hey, look! A passenger near the window shrieked. Fighter jets! They're gonna shoot us down! The cabin exploded. People were screaming, standing, clawing at each other. The thin veneer of civilized society evaporated into raw, animal terror. Audrey didn't look at them. She looked at the keypad next to the cockpit door. Company policy dictated she stay in the cabin, maintain order, let the pilots fly. But the pilots couldn't fly, and the kids in those Hornets were 3 minutes away from getting authorization to fire. She knew the rules of engagement. She helped write some of them. She punched her emergency override code into the keypad. A red light flashed. The door didn't unlatch. The electrical failure had killed the locking mechanism's power, defaulting it to a deadbolt state. Audrey let out a slow, hissing breath. She stepped back, raised her right leg, and drove the heel of her practical, sensible uniform shoe directly into the locking latch. It didn't budge. She kicked it again, channeling the frustration of her aching back, her ruined career, and the smell of the burning coffee into the strike. On the third kick, the internal latch sheared. The heavy door swung inward. The cockpit was a nightmare. The glass panels were black. Dead. The standby instruments, tiny analog dials, were the only things functioning. The master caution alarms were silent, robbed of power, but the red warning lights above the glare shield were glowing off the battery bus. Adler was soaked in sweat. His jacket was off, his tie undone. He was hauling back on the yoke with both hands, his face contorted in panic. The first officer, a kid who looked barely 25, was frantically flipping breakers on the overhead panel, his hands shaking so violently he kept missing the switches. "I have no pitch control," Adler screamed, not looking back at the door. "Trim is dead. Mayday, Mayday, Denver Center. This is Flight 442. We are blind and deaf," he was shouting into a dead headset. Audrey stepped into the cockpit. The temperature in here was 10 degrees hotter. The smell of ozone was thick enough to taste. "They can't hear you, David," Audrey said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. A cold plunge pool in the middle of a house fire. Adler jerked his head around. "What are you doing in here? Get back in the cabin." "We have 2 F-18s off our wings," Audrey said, stepping behind the first officer's seat. "You're ignoring a visual intercept command. They think we're a hostile threat." "I can't fly this damn thing and watch the window," Adler yelled, his arms trembling as he held the heavy yoke. "The radios are gone." Audrey looked at the center console. The main VHF radios were dark. But the emergency backup radio, tied to the essential battery bus, had a faint green light. "VHF-2 is on battery," Audrey said. "It's dead. I tried 121.5. I tried guard. I tried everything." Adler spat, his eyes wild. "Nobody is answering." Audrey stared at the digital frequency display. Adler was using standard civilian emergency frequencies. The Hornets were military. They would be monitoring guard, but in an active intercept with a non-responsive civilian, they'd switch to a tactical discrete frequency to coordinate a firing solution without cluttering the airwaves. She looked out the first officer's window. The left-wing Hornet was close. So close she could read the tail flash. A red bull's head. The 120th Fighter Squadron. Colorado Air National Guard. The red eyes. Audrey knew them. She used to fly aggressor against them out of Nellis. She leaned over the center console, ignoring the first officer who was staring at her in shock. She reached out with her sticky, coffee-stained fingers and grabbed the tuning knob of the backup radio. She spun it, blowing past the civilian bands, dropping into the UHF tactical range. "What are you doing?" Adler shouted. "Don't touch that." Audrey grabbed the spare headset, hanging off the back of the first officer's chair. She jammed it over her neatly pinned hair. The heavy plastic ear cups blocked out the roar of the air rushing over the nose. She pressed the push-to-talk switch on the yoke panel. "Red-eye flight," Audrey said. The tone of her voice changed completely. The polite flight attendant was dead. The voice that came over the frequency was a sharp, clipped military cadence, crisp, completely devoid of emotion and dripping with authority. "This is civilian aircraft Boeing 767, squawking blind, visual on your position. Keep your goddamn fingers off the master arm switches. We are heavy, hard broke, and trying to keep this pig in the sky." For 3 agonizing seconds, the radio gave back nothing but static. Then a voice crackled through the headset, deep, confused, and heavily modulated by an oxygen mask. "Civilian aircraft. Say again? Who is this?" Audrey looked out of the window, right at the dark visor of the fighter pilot, 50 feet away. "This is call sign Wraith," Audrey said softly. "And you're too close to my wing, Lieutenant. Back off before I drag you into our wake turbulence." The static on the UHF channel hissed, a dry electric sound that felt entirely disconnected from the heavy, mechanical death spiral happening inside the 767. "Wraith?" The voice in the headset was younger than she expected. There was a tremor in it. The harsh oxygen mask modulation couldn't hide the confusion. "Civilian, you are broadcasting on a restricted military frequency. Identify yourself." Audrey kept her eyes locked on the F-18 outside the first officer's window. She could see the pilot's helmet shifting. He was looking at his wingman, trying to make sense of the ghost haunting his radio. "This is Major Audrey Collins, USAF, separated," Audrey said, her voice dropping an octave, slipping effortlessly into the flat, deadpan cadence of a fighter pilot working a problem. "Former Commander, 65th Aggressor Squadron, and unless you want to explain to the FAA why you let a heavy civilian tube drill a hole in the Rockies, you're going to give me a goddamn vector, Lieutenant." The silence stretched for 2 seconds. It felt like an hour. The 767 shuddered violently, dropping another 100 feet. Her lower back screamed as the G-forces compressed her spine against the bulkhead. "Copy, Wraith," the F-18 pilot finally said. The skepticism was gone. The military brevity snapped back into place. "This is Red Eye 11. You are currently 30 miles west of Denver, descending through Angels 1-2. You are headed straight for the front range." 12,000 feet. Denver's elevation was already a mile high. The granite peaks in front of them were pushing 14,000. They were flying below the rocks, blind, in a heavy aluminum tube with no power. "David," Audrey snapped, pulling one ear cup off. Adler was hyperventilating, his knuckles bone white on the yoke. He was trying to haul the nose up, but the 767's elevators, deprived of their main hydraulic assist, were like concrete slabs. "I can't, it's too heavy. The trim is gone. We're in a valley. You need to turn left, heading 090. Now," she ordered. "I can't see anything. We're in the soup." Adler yelled, his voice cracking. A bead of sweat dripped off his nose and splattered on his thigh. "I don't care what you can see," Audrey said. She stepped fully into the cockpit, leaning over the center pedestal. She smelled the sour, acrid tang of the first officer's terror. The kid, Wyatt, his name tag read, was staring at his dark screens, completely paralyzed. Audrey grabbed Wyatt by the shoulder of his uniform shirt. She twisted the fabric hard, her knuckles digging into his collarbone. "Wyatt, look at me." she barked. The kid blinked, his eyes wide, watery plates. "Put your hands on the yoke," Audrey commanded. "David cannot pull this out alone. You have to physically pull. Now." Wyatt swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he reached out and gripped the black horns of the yoke. "On 3, Audrey said, her voice a cold steel rod in the sweltering ozone-choked cockpit. "Red Eye 1-1, Wraith. We are initiating a left-hand climbing turn to 090. Talk me through the rocks." "Copy, Wraith. Bring her left. You have a ridge 2 miles dead ahead. You need to clear it by 1,000 feet. Audrey looked at the analog standby altimeter. It was unwinding with terrifying speed. 1, 2, 3, pull, she shouted. Adler and Wyatt hauled back on their yokes. The physical exertion was immense. Audrey could hear Adler groaning, the tendons in his neck standing out like steel cables. The floor of the 767 vibrated, a deep, structural groan that vibrated up through Audrey's cheap, sensible shoes. The airframe resisted. It wanted to fall. Audrey felt a flash of pure, unadulterated hatred for the engineers at Boeing. In an F-18, the stick was an extension of your arm. You thought about moving, and the jet moved. Here they were fighting a massive, sluggish beast that was actively dying. "More! Pull harder!" Audrey yelled. She leaned over Wyatt, wedging her hip against his seat, and wrapped her own sticky, coffee-stained hands around the center column of his yoke. She threw her weight backward, adding her strength to the kid's. Pain shot up her spine, a white-hot needle from her tailbone to her skull. She gritted her teeth, tasting copper. "Red Eye, we are max effort," Audrey grunted into the headset. "Hold that attitude, Wraith. You're coming up on the ridge." The grey soup outside the windows turned darker. The milky white clouds shifted into a bruised, terrifying charcoal. It was the shadow of the mountain. They were close enough to the granite that the proximity was changing the ambient light. "Terrain, terrain. Pull up." The automated voice didn't sound. The speakers were dead. Only the wind tearing past the cockpit glass screamed at them. Then the darkness broke. They punched through the side of the cloud bank, less than 500 feet below their right wingtip. A jagged spine of snow-capped granite whipped past. It was so close, Audrey could see individual pine trees clinging to the rock face. Adler let out a choked, wet sob. They had cleared it. "Good clear, Wraith," Red Eye 1-1 said. His voice was noticeably tighter. Even the fighter pilot had felt the pucker factor on that one. "You are over the plains. Denver is behind you. I'm steering you toward Buckley Space Force Base. They have a 12,000-foot runway, and they're rolling the trucks." "Copy, Buckley," Audrey said. Her breathing was heavy now. Her pristine, shellacked bun had come undone, a strand of dark hair sticking to the sweat on her cheek. "Distance? 15 miles. Can you drop the gear?" Audrey let go of Wyatt's yoke and looked at the center panel. The primary landing gear lever was dead. "Wyatt," Audrey said, her voice dropping back to the calm, terrifying quiet. "Manual gear extension. Do it now." Wyatt unbuckled, dropping to his knees between the seats. He ripped open a floor panel, exposing the mechanical release handles. He cranked them hard. A massive mechanical thump shuddered through the entire aircraft. It was so violent, it felt like a bomb going off in the cargo hold. The aerodynamic drag hit them instantly. The nose pitched down heavily. "Gear is locked," Wyatt gasped, looking at the 3 tiny green lights that illuminated off the battery. "Red Eye, gear is down," Audrey transmitted. "We have no flaps, no slats. We are coming in hot and heavy. Tell Buckley to foam the far end of the runway, because we are going to blow every tire on this rig." "Copy that, Wraith. I'm moving to your 5 o'clock. I'll walk you down the glide slope." The runway at Buckley was a massive slab of concrete, carved into the high plains east of Denver. From the cockpit of the crippled 767, it looked like a postage stamp. They were coming in way too fast. Without flaps to generate lift at lower speeds, Adler had to keep the airspeed dangerously high just to keep the brick flying. The ground rushed up at them, an ugly brown blur of dormant winter grass and concrete. "Airspeed 200 knots, Wyatt read off the standby dial, his voice shaking. "We're 40 knots too fast, Captain." "I can't slow it down without dropping out of the sky," Adler barked, his eyes wide behind his glasses. Audrey stood perfectly still behind them. She wasn't holding the yoke anymore. There was nothing left for her to do but watch. She felt hollowed out. The adrenaline was beginning to crash, leaving behind a cold, shivering exhaustion. She looked at her hands. They were trembling slightly. "I survived Helmand Province to die in a commercial jet outside Aurora," she thought. A dark, cynical humor bubbled up in her throat. She suppressed a bitter smile. 50 feet, Red Eye 11 called over the radio. "Looking good, Wraith. Flare it." "Flare, David," Audrey commanded. Adler hauled back on the yoke with everything he had. The main landing gear slammed into the concrete. It wasn't a landing, it was a controlled crash. The impact was brutal, a bone-jarring collision that shattered several overhead panels in the cockpit. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling like dead yellow snakes. The nose slammed down a second later. "Brakes! Stand on them!" Audrey yelled. Adler and Wyatt buried the brake pedals into the floorboards. Without the anti-skid systems, the massive tires instantly locked up. The sound was apocalyptic, a deafening high-pitched screech of tearing rubber and scraping metal. Smoke immediately poured up over the leading edge of the wings, thick and black, obscuring the windows. The 767 skidded, the tail fishtailing violently to the right. Adler fought the rudder, trying to keep the nose on the center line. The whole airframe rattled violently, overhead bins in the cabin surely tearing loose, luggage raining down on the panicked passengers. They were eating up runway at a terrifying pace. 3,000 feet, 5,000 feet, 8,000 feet. Pop, 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 pop. The tires were blowing. Chunks of burning rubber flew past the windows. The aircraft dropped a few inches on its right side as the rims ground directly into the concrete, sparking a brilliant, terrifying shower of white-hot metal. Audrey braced herself against the bulkhead, her eyes fixed on the approaching end of the runway. The grass, the fence, the highway beyond it. "Stop! Just stop, you heavy bastard!" Slowly, agonizingly, the inertia began to bleed off. The screeching turned into a deep, guttural groan. The 767 shuddered, leaned heavily on its mangled right main gear, and ground to a sudden, violent halt. Complete silence followed. It was the heaviest silence Audrey had ever heard. The engines were dead. The wind was gone. All she could hear was the ragged, wheezing breath of the captain and the distant, muffled sound of people crying in the cabin. Audrey reached up and pulled the heavy military headset off her ears. She set it carefully on the center console. She smoothed her hands down the front of her polyester apron. "David," she said. Her voice was back to the soft, deferential purr. "Order the evacuation." Adler just stared at her, his mouth opening and closing silently. He looked like he was underwater. Audrey sighed. She reached over, grabbed the emergency PA microphone, and flipped it to battery override. "Evacuate. Evacuate. Unbuckle your seatbelts and leave your bags. Move to the nearest exit," she said clearly. She turned around and walked out of the cockpit. The cabin was a war zone of spilled luggage, deployed masks, and screaming people. The smell of burnt coffee had been entirely replaced by the choking stench of burning rubber and aviation fuel. Audrey moved down the aisle. She deployed the forward slide. She grabbed a hysterical man by the collar and shoved him toward the inflatable ramp. "Jump and slide. Leave the laptop. Move." She was a machine. Empty. Efficient. She cleared the first 10 rows, then the next. The fire crews were already outside, drowning the right wing in thick, white foam. 10 minutes later, Audrey stood on the dry winter grass, 100 yards from the smoking wreckage of Flight 442. The biting Colorado wind whipped her torn uniform skirt around her bruised legs. She had her arms crossed, shivering slightly, watching the EMTs wrap passengers in foil blankets. No one was looking at her. She was just a flight attendant, one of the crew, blending perfectly into the background. Above her, the deep, chest-rattling roar of military turbofans tore the sky. She looked up. The 2 grey F-18s were passing low over the airfield. A victory lap. The lead jet banked sharply, the pilot throwing the aircraft onto its wing for a fraction of a second. A salute. Audrey didn't salute back. She just watched them pull up and vanish into the low cloud deck, chasing the altitude she used to own. A paramedic with a clipboard walked up to her. He looked at her torn uniform, her messy hair, and the dark circles under her eyes. "Ma'am?" he asked gently. "Are you injured? Can I get you anything?" Audrey slowly pulled her gaze away from the clouds. She looked at the paramedic, feeling the familiar dull ache radiating from her lower spine. "Yeah," Audrey said quietly, rubbing the back of her neck. "I could really use a black coffee. But not the stuff from the plane. That's the end of Audrey's flight. But not her story. Sometimes the quietest people in the room carry the heaviest history. If you felt the G-force in this one and loved seeing the unseen hero step up, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who thinks they know what a veteran looks like, and subscribe to the channel for more grounded, gritty stories about raw survival. The skies might be quiet now, but we're just getting started.